Hello, greetings from Charleston, South Carolina in the Petri dish that is COVID and my life. I am not presenting from Vietnam as I wish I were today, but luckily at least one of us is. So we are here today presenting on Understanding Vietnam, the Changing Landscape of 2020 and Beyond. I recognize that this is a very brazen title. We do not purport to teach you all about Vietnam in under an hour. We are really just doing some very small segments of things that we hope will be interesting to you on the admission side. So I'm here presenting today with Nicole Wensley, my fabulous friend and colleague out of Union College, who is the Associate Dean of Admission and the Director of International Admissions, as well as my colleague Chi Thu Ca, who is in Saigon actually, and is the Director of American Education Group Vietnam for our Saigon branch. So thanks for joining us in your evening, Chi. And then I'm Caitlin Worsham. I'm the Director of College Counseling for all of AEG and also of our academic programs. For those of you who don't know us already, I've put little bios on the bottom. You can of course use those. You can reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. Instagram or Facebook stalk us, whatever you're into. So this is our agenda for today. We have way too much material to get through, but we're going to try to get through it all. We are starting with economics and beyond, then moving into critical questions. These are going to be both on your end and kind of the student parent end. Matriculation projections, student performance. This is really cool. This is all new stuff. Thanks, Nicole, for getting all this together. Recruitment strategies, school landscape, application reading, what to watch, and then contact info and resources. So for those of you who have heard me present in the past at International ACAC or the Expendables and also saw the Union talk, you might want to focus your attention on slides 4 to 16. Because some of this data has been repeated. For anyone who was at our Union talk recently, we're hoping that basically there are new nuggets of fabulous information from slide 4 on. So just to try to keep things efficient for all of you out there, we will move on to our first slide. So if you're in this room, you've already basically understood that Vietnam is still a wise investment. It has been a wise investment for a long time. We are a growing market. We have fabulous, fabulous students. But from the economic perspective, which is of course important right now more than ever, we are the fastest growing economy in Southeast Asia. And even though our 3.8% growth has rebounded in the first quarter of 2020, it's still the lowest in 11 years, but we're really hopeful that it's going to go back up to 6.8% in 2021 and upwards from there. There's a lot of data to support these projections, and we're feeling very, very good. For those of you who have European interests in the audience, June 2020, Vietnam ratified a free trade agreement with Europe. That may or may not be of interest to you. And then for those of you who are interested for the program for international student assessment, Vietnamese students consistently rank very well on that. As far as questions go, the questions that are going to drive students to select universities or not, right, and that are going to mean something in relation to this economic landscape have changed markedly since I did this talk, or part of this talk, not so long ago, a little over a month ago. So increasingly our students are very, very concerned about safety. This should come as no surprise to anyone. Obviously with the cases spiking, with civil unrest, with the concerns about racism towards the Asian population, and then the upcoming election, there is not a single family who has gone through my office, my electronic office, I should say, that hasn't asked pretty strongly worded questions about safety. And of course, no university can promise safety at this stage, but it will be interesting to see which universities come up with plans that are accommodating to students and that actually, when you roll the dice on what's gonna work, right, where the gambles work out and where they don't. So anything that you can do to alleviate parent and student fears at this stage about these issues is of course what you want to be doing. That should be the top message, I guess, that's going out right now. The second biggest question that I'm being asked is about the online learning cost. Is the cost really going to go down that much? A lot of universities have already presented what they're going to do, but I'm telling you that if the cost does not go down, the students are not going to come your way, my friends. So that applies to, well, I'm going to go into the next slide in a minute, but that applies to the existing population and of course the fall 2020 population as well. The question that not so many of my students ask but should ask, and the thing that I think would be most useful for your side of recruitment moving forward, is OPT and CPT. every time I talk, I tell people, or I meet with people, if you can get data that shows that you have great success with OPT and CPT placement, that means a lot to our families, because when they're buying into a US education, they are buying into the ability to work, right? And to have that experience in the United States. And what I think is really interesting about rankings is that there is no ranking system that is actually designed for international students right now that takes this into account. So as a university trying to still get students out of Vietnam in the coming years, this is what I would focus on. Obviously, you can only use historic data, which is probably not going to be relevant anymore, but it's at least somewhere to start. So that sort of takes us into issues of getting to campus. As you can see or not see on the left, this is a little picture from June of this past June, looking for flights for July from Hanoi to the United States. As you can see, there are still plenty of flights. They're a little bit more expensive than usual. None of our students seem to care that there is a massive, increase in cost. I mean, they do care, but they're not going to not come because of the cost. The bigger issues are the issues above, which is why the ranking of the questions has sort of changed since my last talk. The option to get visas is basically they're still getting visas. If they haven't already gotten an interview, it's going to be very, very difficult for them to get to campus if you're one of the universities that has decided to open early, because visa interviews are scheduled out until mid-August, right? So are students coming? Will students come? They should be fine if they've already scheduled their interview. If they haven't, be worried. A question that a lot of universities were asking was about the national exam. The national exam has moved to August 8 to 11. So again, any student who you want to come early to campus is going to be inhibited by that, and they all want to sit the national exam. Moving into sort of the next pool of students, right? So that's sort of more your 2020 and returns. But for the future students, the biggest question that everyone's asking is, of course, about testing. There are the normal questions like, will the test actually run? And will the scores be canceled due to something going wrong or someone cheating, which happens, of course, all the time, every year, depending on the test. But the bigger question this year is, of course, is optional really optional? What does it mean? Our data suggests that schools that have said that they are test optional in the past really aren't so optional, which I think is interesting. As far as class of 2021, this is the biggest question. If there are any other people on our side of the desk in the audience that universities can be telling us, if we're going to build good lists for students, we need to understand what you're planning for the class of 2021 depending on deferrals. Because if the class size is going to shrink markedly, then the data that we have to build a list historically is going to be wrong. And we're going to be building all sorts of wrong lists for highly competitive universities that our students have no chance in if the 2021 class is shrinking in size due to accommodate the deferrals from 2020. So anything that you guys can do to get out there and answer those questions for counselors in Vietnam or in the world, I think is going to be super helpful. Sorry, guys. Okay, so matriculation projections. This is the most interesting slide that I have today, or I think it is. So the two images on the left are from before when we did this presentation. And as you can see, most students were still interested in going to the United States for university. And then a lot of them were planning on deferring and attending and going elsewhere, right? There was sort of a mix of data. But now, since I've polled since early June, 100% of my students for 2020 in our pool are now considering a gap semester or year, right? So this whole blue marker of 48.3% has shifted. There's still, a lot of them are still deciding. And then 100% of our students in the 2022 plus are considering looking outside of the US now. And I would say the majority of 2021 for me. She has slightly different data. She was saying it was sort of a third for deferrals and attendees and online for her pool out of Saigon. So it's interesting that we're seeing different data in both Hanoi and Saigon, and we hope that's useful for you guys. So some of that is kind of bad news, I know. So what's great is that I'm gonna shift it off to Nicole, and it's gonna be good news from here, guys. Here you go. Nicole.
Well, I think it's good news in that, hey, the students from Vietnam are super awesome, and B, if they don't want to come to the US, that's a wicked bummer for us. But in terms of numbers at Union, so I just thought for those who are maybe just looking to Vietnam or are just sort of trying to consider opportunities to get to Vietnam for recruitment when we can travel again, or to reach out and connect. I wanted to offer some opportunities for my colleagues to have some numbers in place to understand what the possibility is there. So the numbers on the screen right now just show the history of our application and admits, and just to give you a general idea of how that community has grown for us at Union and what the potential is, I think. So we've seen mostly a steady increase in applications, with some blips here and there that I'm not really sure how to explain, but definitely an increase in applications, increase in admits for our students at Union. The other thing that I really wanted to do is say, you know, if you're just starting to look at reviewing applications from students in Vietnam, it's tricky because typically, unless you have a never-ending supply of money for financial aid, you have to make choices in terms of who to admit. And the problem is that those choices typically are not very easily made for you, because what I did here is I pulled at Union our a kind of a review of what our data is for applicants, and what you'll see is looking at their SATs, looking at their high school GPAs, they all look great. So on average, the students are amazing academically. So you're not necessarily weeding anyone out based on academics. So the way of making decisions really is far more complex if you have to make choices. So, you know, I sort of pity a little bit those who, you know, really have a ton of applications, because the numbers really make it really tricky to begin to make choices. The students are all pretty spectacular in terms of their academic profile. So again, what I did is I pulled here some interesting information that compares our average GPA and distribution for all of our students at Union. So these are current Union students, and compared them to the GPAs of our Vietnamese students. So not only for our students when they apply to Union, do their academic profiles look stellar, but when they get to Union, also stellar. So they continue to do really well, to, you know, really perform well. And, you know, and so what I'd say about this is that a lot of times with the Vietnamese applicants, I feel like there's just a ton of really great kids who are going to be really successful. And I feel like the deeper thing is really looking to find fit, because academically they're incredibly prepared, and incredibly prepared to really be successful at a place like Union, but I think most places. The other thing I have here is retention. So the other thing I really love, so, you know, I love all international students. The Vietnamese students are amazing. And, you know, I think some of this may reflect the fact that students are choosing a liberal arts and science college. They've already sort of leapt a little further to think about the environment they want to be in, and a nurturing space, and gone a little further to choose that environment. But once they get to campus, they stay. So I think for campuses looking at retention issues, or looking to sort of solidify their student body, as we all are, when you look at retention, I think that really speaks for itself. The students come, they're dedicated to the school that they come to. We don't see our students transferring out, and they graduate in 4 years. So I think, you know, again, to the point of not only are they doing well, but within 4 years, they're dedicated to being there, they're successful. And for those on the you know, counseling side, whether it's independent or high school counseling, what you see is that, you know, our students graduate in 4 years. That's always what we talk about. Just a little pitch for small schools, that in 4 years they've been able to complete their education and move on to whatever's next for them. But I think those are impressive numbers. So the other thing I think people think about or ask about is, you know, do Vietnamese students typically gravitate to particular disciplines? Now, remembering, Union is a liberal arts and science college. We have a lot of majors, but I would say that our international students, on average, tend to gravitate towards the more STEM side of things, though we have a beautiful array of opportunities for majors and minors. So this may be less reflective of perhaps the Vietnamese population and more reflective of the word on the street for Union in terms of STEM. But in terms of majors, we do see our students a lot within the computer science, engineering, and the STEM fields. But economics is definitely, and economics paired with computer science, incredibly popular for our students, definitely thinking more towards the business realm of things. And students really enjoying some of our fun minors. So I think for the students who choose the LACs, they really enjoy not only having a major in a field maybe that they see their future in, but being able to sort of dabble in some things like music, or gender studies, or some other things that they might have an interest in. So just a little bit about where students are academically. I did ask our students to tell me a little bit about what they're doing outside of the classroom, because again, we want to see what students are doing and what their presence is on campus. So for us, what we saw is a mix of students doing things that relate to their major, whether it's research and internships, or opportunities like the chemistry club, or things that are academically related. But what we did see a lot too is students popping up in terms of leadership roles with things like the Asian Student Union, our World Around You, which is our international organization, and also doing some fun things with our Minerva houses for activities, but really getting engaged outside of the classroom in a way that, of course, balances well their academic focus. So I asked students, again, this is in the framework of these are students that chose a small LAC, but I asked students what it has been most important to you in your college search. And this is, again, students who've just graduated all through to our first year students, and connection with professors was definitely, obviously, very high on their list. So I think, again, these students have chose a small LAC perhaps for that connection reason, but is definitely something that's resonated to them. Internships was another thing that really jumped out, internship opportunities for our students. And which is interesting that research is a little lower, because maybe it's because all students do research at Union. They take it for granted. I don't know, but internships definitely jumped up, and then that connection to campus. The students that I've been talking to really feel like Union's their home, and it's been a little weird going back to Vietnam and being there, and they just want to get back to their home and be with their people. So I think maybe this jumped out a little bit more because they're missing that right now. But I just offer that up as some things to talk about with students. We did also ask about how connected students felt to campus, and I did see some variation between some first-year students to the upper level students, but for the most part, students felt very connected to their campus. And Caitlin, if you want to go to the next slide. And I asked sort of, what does your friend group make up, right? So how are you connecting to our campus, and thinking about what your friend group looks like? Are you able to get out of the Vietnamese bubble, or are you sort of finding your comfort in your friends from your home country? And what we found is that it really is that students are finding friends in a mix of Vietnamese, other international students, and US students alike. So I think that hopefully means that they're getting the experience they were looking for when they came to the US. We did ask what you hate about campus. or I think I asked it more PC, like, if you could change some things, what would it be? And, the comments were things like, I wish you'd upgrade the bathroom in this residence hall, or, mostly the food. Like, why are you messing with the Vietnamese food? Just make it like it's supposed to be. So I thought that was kind of cute. Lastly, I asked the question of, would you recommend Union to a friend? And the reason I asked this question, I think, is not only to see how happy they are, but also because we rely at Union really heavily on student to student and alum to student recruitment. And I think beyond everything else, and it doesn't matter necessarily, honestly, where the alum comes from. I had a colleague who was an alum with me in Vietnam last year, and she's from the US, but the way she was able to connect and speak with students, as well as our other Vietnamese alum, I think that and our current students really is what is most impactful for our recruitment. So I know we're going to talk about recruitment a little bit later. I hope this is a good segue, and I'll kind of jump in where you want Caitlin to just talk a little bit more about that.
Okay, Chi, take it away.
So in this slide, I just really want to start with the good news, and that is that there is a lot of evidence that Vietnamese students are still really interested in going to American universities. But what does this mean for recruitment strategies for fall 2021 and beyond, especially when in-person recruiting is now near impossible? And so our first recommendation is to just not reinvent the wheel. What has worked before will likely still work now, but with different moving parts. And so word of mouth is still king. Current students, parents, and alum are your best ambassadors. Current and past students and parents play a really big role in what I call translating a university's value to a local market, especially in countries where English isn't the primary language. So I always say to make sure that you really take care of your international students and alum. For international students, they buy into the value of a university brand a lot more than domestic students do, because an international university affiliation for an international student adds real value to their lives that they just can't get with an in-country education. Universities that tend to do really well in Asia tend to have a really active alumni chapter, either individually as an institution or part of a larger network. And so, for example, UCLA has its own alumni network here in Vietnam, but they're also part of a larger group of UC-wide alum, and they're a very active member of an institutional networking group I affectionately renamed Ivy League Alumni Plus Plus, which has Ivy League schools and top-ranked public universities networking together. And so I encourage that universities give alumni the support they need to grow region-specific alumni chapters in international markets. Another effective recruitment strategy we've seen is on-the-ground representation and representative offices located regionally in the area and in-country. This year in particular, they've been an excellent source for students and parents when they have questions about visas, deferrals, and more. There are rumors now circulating today that Vietnam might extend border lockdown until after the hugely important Party Congress elections in January 2021. The rationale is that it would look really bad and potentially would disrupt the smooth transition of power if there was a second wave of COVID infections between now and January 2021. If this happens, this means IECs, school counselors, and in-country admission reps become even more important. My third point is that we're also seeing the increasing importance of countrywide partnerships between different stakeholders who have banded together to create advisory boards to coordinate university travel and recruitment, particularly by Australia and New Zealand educational institutions in ways that I just don't see American institutions doing in Vietnam yet. EdUSA has recently been doing a lot more work, recently through a series of E2E meetings with mostly agents and IECs with university reps and state consortiums. So there's definitely movement towards creating the similar organizations that I see in Australia and New Zealand. But I also want to conclude this before I return to Nicole for a second, is that I want to emphasize the continued importance of working with trustworthy IECs on the grounds, because oftentimes we've been in country for far longer. So for those of us who work in education in Vietnam, we often joke that despite Vietnam's prominence in sending students internationally for higher education, most international school teachers and counselors tend to see of Vietnam as sort of like a pit stop on a longer journey to a more prestigious and livable post, like in Switzerland or Singapore or the UK. So this means that people like myself and Caitlin, who have dedicated ourselves to the Southeast Asian educational market, tend to have been there longer and know more about the institutional, regional, and country trends. Nicole, do you have anything to add for recruitment strategies?
Well, every time I talk to Uchi, I'm taking notes, right? And Caitlin, I'm like, oh wait, I didn't get that last time. I got to make that note. So thank you. I think with the recruitment strategies, so not all of us are really huge schools and have, billions of alumni and the ability to have in-country representation in the person of a regional or something. So what I would say is, again, going back to your use of, so right now, current students that are currently, unfortunately for them, but fortunately for us in some ways, home so that they can do person-to-person contact. Vietnam is open. So as I was talking to a student this week, she said, like, we can have tea and we can hang out because, we can get out and we can do things. So using the students currently to connect and looking at ways that we can, host opportunities for students to connect with prospective students and their families, utilizing our alumni who still can connect. I think really focusing those efforts on what we can do in individual ways with either independents or students who've reached out, and really allowing them the opportunity to have, I think, a vision beyond the current status in the U.S., to remind them, what the U.S. looks like when we're not in a state of pandemic. So I'd say those things are great. The college fair, scene, I've struggled a little bit with, be it a broader, we've always had students show up for in the summer to represent our institution, but there's a lot more, I'd say, college fairs in the scheme of things right now. And so I feel like it's sort of a little overwhelming and sort of maybe less attended by students. We have held public events for students to come and learn on topics of things like essay writing. And so those public events are consortial events with other colleges. We rent out a space and invite students and their families to come. Those have been successful because the students get to learn something concrete from universities, and then also have an opportunity then to talk one-on-one with the institution. So when we get to go back to Vietnam, that definitely is a I think, useful endeavor. I'd also say that there's a lot more space than two cities in Vietnam. So there's a lot more opportunity for opening up in places like Da Nang to really just go outside the two city space.
Okay, so this is going to move us into sort of the different segment of the talk, which is really about application reading. If you're new to the scene, who am I looking at? What are these schools? Where am I? What's going on? So what I've done with the first slide is focused on the region that I directly manage, which is the North, right? I obviously oversee everything, but I have a little bit of a better beat on the North. She is definitely my expert in the South. I would be lost without her. So for Hanoi, our international schools, we have a mix of AP and IB curricula schools. Of course, new schools crop up all the time. I don't expect this slide to be necessarily comprehensive, but it should give you sort of the major players that you might be seeing applications for. I mean, there's still like really cool, weird schools like FPT Vietnam, which is this weird little boarding school, actually, a boys boarding school outside of Hanoi that you might see an application from, but the majority of your apps are coming from these schools. So you'll notice that, of course, we've got our international high schools and we've got our national high schools in Hanoi. And then Haiphong and Halong are not quite, I think, the pull, don't yet have the pull of Da Nang, but they are coming up as far as markets go. And we are definitely seeing students out of those areas increasingly. So depending on how you do recruitment in the future, you do want to be paying attention to those two places. So she's going to talk a little bit more about sort of the national high school model and the 13 subjects and how a lot of other difficulties that we encounter when we're dealing with the public schools. But I did want to draw your attention to the link at the bottom. So Linda Blumberg and Ben Compton out of Concordia have sort of taken the reins of getting all the Hanoi independent school counselors together to put together sort of information for university counselors coming through. And they have always been very, very generous and open with allowing me to send my public school students to whatever events they're holding and to sort of populate information with us. So at least in the North, we're seeing really, really good communication between at least select IECs and the independent schools, which I think is a little bit different in South, but Chi will speak to that. So back to you, Chi.
So this slide, oh, sorry, am I ready?
Yeah.
So this slide talks about the school landscape in Ho Chi Minh City and Da Nang. And so for those of you who are an old hand at the educational landscape in Vietnam, you'll notice that there are basically no major changes here. The same set of international schools, the same set of elite public schools, they still reign supreme. However, what this list hints at but doesn't fully reveal is the immense proliferation of bilingual international schools like Ishmik American Academy, the British Vietnamese International School, the Viet Úc Australian Vietnamese International Schools, and there are many, many more coming. A recent Savills and Freshfields report goes into detail about the hard facts of education growth in Vietnam, and I can link that if anyone's interested. But the basic stats are Vietnam's population is almost at 100 million. It's growing by about 1 million a year and is currently one of the top 5 producers of new high net worth individuals with a minimum net worth of over $30 million. So we add to that a reluctance by the government to reform public education. So what we're seeing is an incredibly high demand for international style education from the pre-K through 12 and also the university level. It's just not abating. Ho Chi Minh City now has over 50 international schools and Hanoi is not far behind. There are more in the works, especially from major land developers like the Singapore-backed Novaland, which is bringing in high school partnerships to do what is essentially a 2+2 university model, but for high schools. On the right-hand side of the slide, we see a short list of Da Nang high schools. Da Nang is a growing player when it comes to sending students abroad. It has been an emerging hotspot for FDI inflow for about 10 years. And Da Nang opened its first international school in 2015, the Singapore International School, and is a great school to visit. I personally recommend on a Friday or a Monday, so you can enjoy a very relaxing weekend at one of Hanoi's best beaches over the weekend. So our next slide, our next series of slides are about the nuts and bolts, how to evaluate Vietnamese applications. And I just want to state this very clearly at the beginning. This is a TLDR summary. No Vietnamese public high school has staff tasked with navigating university applications for students. There is no counselor, there is no registrar. High schools do not send transcripts directly to universities. Schools don't know how to use Common App or Coalition, and there is no such thing as a school profile. Any school profile you are getting was written by a very well-intentioned student or group of students and is being recycled every year without the school's knowledge or consent. Any uploads you are getting of transcripts or letters of rec are done by the student with the teacher's explicit knowledge and consent, or done by the student without the teacher's knowledge and consent. Transcripts are notoriously easy to fake. Oftentimes, schools only provide the Vietnamese version and students are responsible for getting the English translations themselves, which means there is often no institutional way to verify where the transcript came from and who sent it exactly. So even for me, I mean, I'm fully fluent in Vietnamese and English, and I live in Vietnam full time, and I always go through my students' transcripts with a fine-tooth comb before I let them send it out, not because Vietnamese students are any more dishonest and fraudulent than anyone else, but because it is very simply that easy to fake transcripts.
Can I just add something to that, Chi? So you said that it's either by the student or with or without the consent of the counselor. But as you'll notice from the quote that I put up for the Hanoi AM student, typically what alarms me about this process, and I just wanted to make this clear, is that one student will be tasked with managing a bunch of students' applications out of Hanoi, at least, specifically in Hanoi AMS and the other elite public schools there. And so that student technically has access to the login information of all of those students. So if there tends to be some infighting or something goes on, it very much alarms me that those applications can be compromised in that way as well.
So on this next slide, I want to walk through what I look for when I'm reviewing a transcript. And so first I look to see if the student submitted both a Vietnamese and an English version. I and Caitlin, we never let our clients submit transcripts without the Vietnamese original. And so that you can sort of directly verify and see where that information comes from. Even if you don't directly can read and understand Vietnamese, you can see where that information sort of links up. And I think that as a university, you can very easily have your administrative staff check to see if a Vietnamese applicant submitted the Vietnamese original and request one if it is not included. Secondly, this is a black and white photocopy, but I always check for a red stamp on every single page, either from the high school or from the translation office. This is just another metric to make sure that someone official translated and verified this thing is real. Another thing that I want to note is this thing about majors in high schools, which you can see in the upper right-hand corner or along the top in the English translation. So at some of the gifted magnet high schools, and in Vietnam, there is no distinction between gifted and highly gifted. They just name them gifted or highly gifted. They basically mean the same thing. At some of these high schools, they have a major. And the high school majors that students pursue tend to have nothing to do with the majors that they want to study in university. And the reason for that is because in order to be accepted into some of these elite high schools, you have to be one of the top 40 to 50 scores in the city to be accepted into a specific major. And so after you get accepted into a major, you only take classes with the small major cohort for the rest of high school. And the major that is the most competitive is actually English. So savvy parents and students will have their child play the admission game by trying to get admitted to a less competitive major like history or Vietnamese literature. And so for me, when I'm reading a transcript, I always pay extra attention when I get the transcript of a student to see what their major was. If their major was English, then I know that they are truly one of the best students.
Gee, can I ask a couple just quick questions?
Yeah.
Just to keep it real. So you said that English was one of the strongest majors. What are some other ones that jump out to you either as some of the highest or the lowest majors would be my first question.
Mm-hmm. So the hardest majors tend to be English, physics, chemistry. Biology is sort of in the middle. The sort of like the more social sciences or the humanities are like totally at the bottom.
Okay. And then my other question is, you're talking about transcripts, and obviously students are just sometimes, they're not, I think, most often cheating or meaning to, you know, sort of mislead universities, but really just trying to apply to college without any help. When we look at broadening into some of the other cities, is it an issue for some students to actually just get translations or to be able to navigate the system, or is that accessible regardless of the sort of rural nature of the place they're coming from in terms of accessibility to translation services and the like?
Yeah, I mean, every major first tier, second tier, third tier city has a translation office, and you need to have translations if you have English teachers, if you're buying property as a foreigner, if you have FDIs, or foreign direct investments, you have translation offices everywhere. And so any relatively large city, or if you live in the provinces near a major city, you have access to translators. So that's not an issue at all. I just want to, before I talk about this slide, I just want to say very quickly that so much of the nuances when it comes to reading and interpreting transcripts changes every year. So asking local counselors or IECs on trends in fraud or transcripts, I mean, Caitlin and I are super open and happy to share the things that we're seeing that we think can be super helpful when you're evaluating a transcript. So on this next slide, I want to continue talking about letters of recommendation, and I want to turn your attention to the first block of blacked out images on the upper left-hand corner. And so for letters of recommendation from public school students, you can basically expect that students are writing it themselves. Most teachers don't speak English and they don't have time. If they agree to write a letter of recommendation, they will often do so with the condition that students will ghostwrite the letter for them. And so this chart on the left is a shared Google Documents where students created an official teacher email, which never belonged to the teacher, and shared the content, formatting, and layout of the letters of rec this one teacher supposedly wrote, just to make sure that everyone had a uniform structure and used words that were close enough to about the same. I want to pause here and just say that most Vietnamese students work incredibly hard, and they want to get real letters of recommendation from teachers who really know their academic and intellectual promise, but this is quite frankly next to impossible to get. Secondly, I want to turn your attention to the graph and the timetable on the bottom. So when it comes to clubs and activities, again, there is actually legitimate, incredible desire on the part of Vietnamese public school students to do them. But when you have classes that start at 7 a.m. and run until 5 p.m., and then you have optional but kind of mandatory additional classes run from about 5:30 to 7 p.m. taught by these same teachers, who cover all the mandatory material that the teacher couldn't get to in class for a marginal fee. And then you have summer breaks that last only about 2 months in a normal summer and 1 month this summer. This leaves very, very little time for extracurriculars. And I found that actually the most meaningful and useful competitions and awards that I use when I'm evaluating a student tend to be the ones that have the least press and the least social media presence, like the citywide physics or chemistry competitions and regional math competitions. And so what's really been proliferating in the past couple of years that I've been noticing are sort of like these fake clubs that spring up where they buy followers and they have a rash of events over sort of like a 2-month time period and they sort of die out. Thirdly, I want to point out that issues of fraud continue to be a very big problem in financial aid. There is no real way to verify that the financial documents you're receiving are accurate. Fulbright University recently opened an undergraduate campus in Saigon in 2016, and they actually have a pretty high discount rate, or the rate of full pay to FA. And what they do to verify the financial documents that applicants submit is they visit every single applicant in person in their hometown and in their houses. They do a visual inspection of houses, neighborhoods, assets, community infrastructure, and this is something that IACAC members simply just can't do. The US Embassy in Vietnam keeps internal tables about mean income for jobs in specific cities. For example, how much does a pharmacist make in Ho Chi Minh City in the south versus in Da Nang in the central region versus in Haiphong in the north. But these internal tables are not public, and they actually use them when they're evaluating F1 I-20 visas. Also, when you look at conversations about international higher education in Vietnam, there's a particular phrase that shows up all the time, and you'll see it in the right-hand graphic. And the phrase is "săn học bổng," which basically means hunting for scholarships. And you literally see this phrase everywhere in Facebook groups, student groups, agent websites, newspaper articles, promotional materials. It's legitimately everywhere. And what this really indicates is that getting any kind of scholarship still remains the dream for Vietnamese student populations. The ranking of a university is important, but so is how much FA did you get. And so to accommodate this, what I've been noticing in the last, 3 to 5 years, is that there are some agents and IECs that charge a percent commission based on how much FA a university offers a student over a 4-year period. So the higher the FA package the student can get, the higher the commission the agent gets. And so if anything, the global recession is making Vietnamese families much more aware of the price of education, especially the price of American universities vis-a-vis other international institutions. And so, this is something that we all talk about. And so over the past decade, educational inflation has basically gone up about 12% a year versus the basic consumer price index in the United States, which has only increased like 2% per year. And so what that means is that the cost of education in real terms has gone up dramatically, therefore reducing affordability and making it a very different kind of economic proposition, even for international families. And so to sort of partly resolve this, a lot of universities are now exploring branding partnerships and joint ventures with local universities because it's another way to access students without incurring the expense of bringing them to campus. There are obvious issues still to be worked out with this plan. Cornell University, for example, just announced that for Vietnamese students that can't make it to upstate New York for campus this fall, they can pay a discounted rate of $33,000 to go to Cornell's local partner university in Hanoi, the brand new Vingroup University, and take a mix of in-person classes with Vingroup students and online classes with Cornell students. This proposal, by the way, in case you can't read my tone, is not going over very well with Vietnamese students and parents right now. And so the growth of this sort of in-country university partnership during the time of coronavirus is still in the exploratory phase.
She, can I add, or are you done?
I'm done.
So I wanted to ask you one question. Well, first of all, I wanted to comment on the financial aid pursuit, the game, as it were, in Hanoi. It's very interesting to note that the public school students, financial aid is a huge driving factor, not just in where they apply, but in where they ultimately yield. Whereas with all of my independent schools, I would say very, very few of my students who are going to private schools in Hanoi care at all about financial aid. Sure, they love a scholarship, but they're not chasing the money. And I was interested, Chi, for you to comment on that, and then also to comment on the sort of sweet spot for financial aid, because, you know, historically for us, it's been getting more, right? It was 25, however many years ago, it's been 35, more recently 30 to 35. And right now, since you have been on the ground and I have not, if you're seeing that sweet spot shift a little bit more, because I haven't been there in the room with as many families talking about financial aid this year.
What's been really interesting is that I've noticed that a lot of universities and colleges are increasingly giving merit-based awards to boarding school students in quantities that I haven't noticed before, and that it's, especially this year, it's playing a role in where students decide to matriculate. And this is something that I had never really seen in the past 10 years of doing this job, that boarding school students are now like, oh, I'm getting a financial aid package, I'm going to go here instead. I had never really seen that before. When it comes to public school students and the magic number, I mean, they're definitely becoming much savvier. I mean, I would say probably 5 years ago, public school students uniformly across the board all applied for financial aid. Yeah. Now there's definitely, they really understand that there's a differentiation in the market between the kinds of institutions you can get into and the kinds of aid that you can get and how this affects the list. And so increasingly we're getting more and more public school students who are asking for 10,000 in financial aid, 15,000 in financial aid. This doesn't mean that there aren't public school students who are asking for a lot more. And I feel like for the average that I'm seeing for public school students in their ask for financial aid, or sorry, in their expected parent contribution right now still is in the sort of like the 25 to 30 range, but that their pursuit is a full ride scholarship so that they can brag about it to all of their friends in the Facebook groups and the newspapers.
Okay, thanks, Chi. So we're going to go into one of our final sort of super content-filled slides, which goes back to making things official. So the images on the left are of a Vietnamese identification. So you're not going to get what it looks like, but it is a very flimsy piece of sort of laminated paper. It's the kind of thing my mom could have made in her basement in the 60s. And you can see, you know, the image, super airbrushed, right? And this is actually not a student at all. This is my lovely staff member in Hanoi who yielded her identification. And what I think is important about this is she could easily pass for a student, and she is in her 30s. So the problem with identification in general is important when we're talking about testing. So, you know, even if a student does have an ID, is the ID them? Are students actually using fake IDs yet? I don't think so, actually. I have never had a student tell me that another student went in yet with a fake ID, but this is something that I deeply worry about moving forward, because it is not difficult to pass a student off for another student. And as I would say, agents get sort of grimier moving forward, this is something to consider and just be aware of. So if you were to look at my old resident card, that I am so airbrushed in my image, and I had black hair at the time, that I could have passed for a Vietnamese student. I mean, the image quality is really, really airbrushed, and no one seems to have a problem with that. So that has to do with just getting into the testing. But what's interesting is that I was talking to Chi the other day about TOEFL and IELTS testing. And I was saying that it's so interesting when I talk to my students about their experience of going into the testing center. So on top of complaining about things like, oh, there was a funeral going on next door and there were gongs playing throughout my entire TOEFL test and they insisted that I couldn't stop the test midway or get a refund, separate problem. Or, oh, my keyboard didn't actually have any of the letters on it, so I had a real struggle typing, separate problem. They're actually not being identified. They're not being asked for identification at some TOEFL centers sometimes. So, and that could be just like random math that my students just haven't been asked for identification, but she has said that this is not as much of a problem in Saigon, which I think suggests a very different level of savvy down there. And you can kind of see that in some of the things that we're saying that are different versus some of the things that are the same. So as far as things that are the same, right, that's going back to the transcripts that she mentioned and the idea of the red stamp. So those of you who have seen this talk before, I got new images for you of the red stamp. The red stamp is a little janky piece of plastic that you can buy at the red stamp store, pictured here. And very easy to mock up. So I know that she is saying, yes, look for the red stamp ultimately, but ultimately anything is fudgeable. And I think we're going to increasingly see this to be a problem in the future. So what do we do, right, when reading applications? I've just told you all of the bad news, or really Chi told you most of the bad news. I just sort of, put the bow on it. So my strong feeling, and Chi will totally back me up, and I think Nicole would back me up, which is that if you really want to get to know a candidate, and you got to do an interview, right? And there are great online interview platforms that we all have different feelings about, and there are great options for, of course, Skype interviews now. And I'm hoping that potentially one of the small benefits of COVID, and I understand that this is very, very optimistic of me, is that university reps will have more time in their schedule to process interviews or to mandate interviews. I know, don't laugh at me, Chi, I see what you're doing. But that is the dream for me, because ultimately, if you're going to truly evaluate these students, having a conversation with them is so different from looking at their data points. And that's what Nicole is saying when she's saying that, the kids are great, they're all great, but some of the kids definitely are very, very different in person than they are on paper. And if you can get to those kids, you're gonna get the kids that are the right fit for you. So I'm going to move to our final slide. Guys, we did well. We kept it in time. Yay, winning. So on this final slide is, of course, our information. We are all available to you. Chi and I love to answer follow-up questions. I know we're going to have a forum to do some chattable questions into the future. What I wanted to say is that if you're not already connected to us, what we try to do is make your recruitment process easier moving forward. Now, of course, recruitment is changing, but were you to want to reach out to the high school counselors that are real and existent and on the ground, we give out a PDF every year so that you can more easily make those connections, because again, as Chi mentioned, there is a serious rotation of high school counselors on the independent school side for the reasons that she mentioned. And they're all fabulous, and we try to connect with them all and put them all in a nice little sheet for you for your ease of access. So unless Chi or Nicole, you have anything else to add? No? Chi, shake your head no. Okay, or yes. I just wanted to thank everybody for coming. We really, really hope to see you in person at some future international ACAC or on the ground in Vietnam one day when I can return. And we hope you're having a wonderful, wonderful quarantine summer or semi-quarantine summer, and staying safe out there. So thanks for joining us today.